I made this series of 12 live videos over the 2022-23 holiday season. I think it's a good series, but the YouTube algorithm kind of buried it. So I've re-edited the videos and I'm re-releasing them onto my main channel over the coming weeks in the hope that more people will find them. Let me know if you're finding them useful and if you have questions. So here's the plan. Over the next 12 days, I'm going to be telling a story called The Adventures of Art, Son of Conn. And it's a great story in itself, but I'm mostly going to be using it as a springboard for taking us down all sorts of mythological tangents that I can see branching off from the story. So things you might find interesting, things I'm slightly obsessed with, the usual. So hopefully you'll learn a few things as we go, and we can have a nice time also looking at this story really closely. It's a favorite story of mine. If you'd like to read the whole story of Art, Son of Conn, or hear me telling it from beginning to end in one go, I've put links in the description of this video to where you can find those things. So here we go with the beginning of the story. So Conn of the 100 Battles was a great king who ruled in Tara. And for 9 years he had ruled. And in that time, Ireland knew great prosperity. But then grief befell Conn because his wife Ethne, his queen, died. And now he found himself sitting on her great grave mound that he'd raised for her, and he was desolate. He was unable to think of the good of his kingdom. He was unable to effectively rule. The state of affairs seemed to drag on. And finally, he knew that he needed to shake himself out of it. Perhaps if I walked by the sea, he thought, the sound of the waves and the clean air would wash some of this gloom away, and I'd be able to see things more clearly. So he took himself off to the beach at Howth to walk there on the beach, and he left his son Art in charge of the kingdom. Well, it was just about this time that something remarkable was happening in the land of promise, a part of the other world. A woman called Beikva had been found guilty of breaking the marriage laws of the Sidhe, and she was being sent out of that world and into the world of the mortals of Ireland. Messengers were sent to Angus at the Brunabanya, warning him not to let Beikva come into the Sidhe mounds, that all the Sidhe mounds should refuse entry to her. She was truly banished from her people. But for her part, Beikva made the best of things. She chose to appear in the world of men, in the world of mortals, dressed in her finest clothing. She put on a red satin smock and a long cloak of green silk fringed with gold. She wore sandals of white bronze on her fair little white feet. Her hair was just the color of gold. Her mysterious gray eyes were large enough for a man to lose himself in. Her lips were red as rowans, her teeth a row of white pearls behind them. The people of the other world were sorry indeed that they would no longer be able to look on her. But Beikva had looked through the world, through the mists, into the world of men, and she'd seen something. Someone, actually. And she'd set her heart on him. And that was Art, son of Conn. So we'll leave the story there for today. There's so much here we could talk about. I don't even know. We could spend 2 or 3 sessions just dealing with it. But I wanted to give you enough of a hook just to let you know that it's going to be a good story, because it really is a good story. So a little bit of context. This story comes from Ireland, and people often think that all Irish mythology is about the gods, the Tuatha Dé Danann, and their magical doings. But this story comes from a corner of Irish myth known as the historical cycle, or cycle of the kings. And there's a good book compiled by, she looks for the book. There it is. compiled by Miles Dillon, which contains some of these stories and some information about them. And this book is called The Cycles of the Kings. And there's also a few of these in Ancient Irish Tales, edited by Cross and Slover, and in The Celtic Heroic Age, edited by Cochin Carey. And you can check out my video about the best Celtic mythology books for more information on those. So modern scholars who study Irish myths sometimes divide the stories into 4 categories called cycles. The mythological cycle, which is very much about the Tuatha Dé Danann and how they came to Ireland and so on. So I know that's confusing. We've got the 4 cycles of Irish mythology, and one of them is called the mythological cycle. And then we have the Ulster cycle, or the Táin. And this is the one about Queen Maeve and Conn and the cattle raid of Cooley and so on. Then there's the Fenian cycle, the Finn cycle. And that's about the adventures of Finn MacCool, obviously, and his men. And finally, we have the historical cycle, or cycle of the kings, which is where we are today. The thing is, the Tuatha Dé Danann, who many of us see as gods, show up in all 4 cycles. And I find that one of the best things about the cycle of the kings for me is that we have these legendary, often somewhat historical kings, but they're still interacting with Tuatha Dé Danann, who frequently pop up in their world. There's possibly something a little bit artificial about this way of dividing myth up. It's a modern idea, dividing it into 4 cycles as if it's Wagnerian opera. So we know from several early Irish texts that the medieval Irish poets and storytellers, they classified the stories by type. So the modern tendency is to look for a long saga. And there's certainly evidence for this in the myths, but perhaps the professional storytellers of old found it more useful to think about single stories by type. So they had adventures and voyages, elopement, violent deaths, all sorts of things. The list is quite a bit longer than the one you see on the screen, and there's not one definitive list. But I can see advantages in this way of thinking about stories. If you're telling stories at a wedding, then you want stories about courtship and romance. If you're telling stories before a battle, you want stories about heroism and so on. And we can see from the Welsh triads that Welsh bards also grouped stories by what they had in common. So if you're interested in knowing more about different ways of categorizing Celtic myths, there's a very good chapter in this book called Celtic Heritage by Alwyn and Brinley Rees. It's been around for a long time, so there's different covers. And the chapter is called The Storyteller's Repertoire, and it talks about just this sort of thing. Celtic Heritage is a great book for helping you understand what's going on with Celtic myth more generally. It's not a book of stories, but it's a very useful book if you're reading Irish or Welsh mythology. So back to the cycle of the kings and to Conn of the 100 Battles, who the story was about a minute ago. So Conn's often referred to with terms like semi-historical or legendary. It's quite probable that he was a historical person, but that doesn't mean that all the legends which grew up about him later are factual. So the historical Conn is thought to have lived way back in the 2nd century. His seat is said to have been at Tara, which later came to be considered the seat of the High Kings of Ireland. So later storytellers sometimes present him as if he's the High King of Ireland. But for most of Irish history, there were actually lots of different kings. Even if the king at Tara called himself the High King, not everyone would have agreed. So Conn is definitely seen as a bit of a foundational character, a bit of a foundational ancestor. Lots of kings trace their lineage back to him. And there's another story about Conn where the god Lu appears to him and confers sovereignty on him and recites a list of his descendants. And all this is really just a long way around to saying that Conn is a very big deal. And although the story is called The Adventures of Art, son of Conn. It's as much about Conn as it is about art, as you'll see in the coming days. Now, you may have wondered about the mention of Beikva, this woman in the other world, breaking the marriage laws of the Sidhe, or the fairy people. So that's something which is portrayed differently in different stories, different Irish stories. And that probably depends on the attitude of the person responsible for writing the story down. So it's almost certainly a case of the prevailing attitudes of the time in which the story was recorded. But how or why Beikva is driven out of the other world isn't half as interesting as the fact that she was. So I think we just have to accept and enjoy the story. And sometimes that just works better than trying to re-engineer it back to some imagined pre-Christian form that we can only guess at. However, for modern storytellers, I found this, when I decided how I would tell the story, I did have to put some thought into what I would, how I would play that. And you can look in the links and find the original Irish and a straight English translation side by side if you'd like to see exactly what it says. Another great retelling of this story is by an author called James Stephens. And even Stephens makes quite a meal of creating an explanation for Beikva's banishment. This is from James Stephens. And he says, you'll have to excuse his spelling. He's doing that thing that people did early in the 20th century of anglicizing the spelling of Irish words to make English readers more able to have a shot at pronouncing them. So he says, in the Sidhe, matrimony is recorded as being parallel in every respect with earth marriage. So I think by the Sidhe here, he means in the Sidhe mounds in Ireland. And the desire which urges to it seems to be as violent and inconstant as it is with us. In other words, people get horny. But in the many-colored land, marriage is but a contemplation of beauty, a brooding and meditation wherein all grosser desire is unknown and children are born to sinless parents. He goes on, in the Sidhe, the crime of Beikva would have been lightly considered and it would have received none but nominal punishment. But in the second world, so in the other world, he's saying, a horrid gravity attaches to such a lapse, and the retribution meted out is implacable and grim. So Stephens is really just following some of the odd ideas about the other world put forth by Christian scribes during a certain period when they tended to kind of conflate the Irish otherworld with the Christian heaven. So you can see that as Christian propaganda, but I think it's much more a case of not wanting to get rid of their native ideas about the otherworld. Yet they needed to somehow reconcile those native ideas with Christian ideas. So the James Stephens version is a real pleasure to read, in spite of how much he's struggling, as we all do, with this, why did Beikva get thrown out of the other world? So don't dismiss it on the strength of how he handles this passage. It's actually a good read, and he's a very witty guy and has a really nice command of the language. So another thing I'd like to mention, just finally, is the description of Beikva. So I love these very lush, colorful descriptions of beautiful people in Celtic myths. Remember, they're there for entertainment. They're there for enjoyment. And they really do make these people look like film stars, and they have the most amazing bling. So I hope you enjoy the pictures the stories paint. So I'll just read you a little bit of R.I. Best's translation from the Irish of the description of Beikva, which you've already heard me say when I was telling the story. Thus was the maiden. She had a green cloak of one color about her, with a fringe of red thread of red gold, and a red satin smock against her white skin, and sandals of white bronze on her soft, Oh, I've missed a bit out there on her feet, and soft yellow hair, and a gray eye in her head, and lovely colored teeth, and thin red lips, black eyebrows, arms straight and fair of hue, a snowy white body, small round knees, a slender choice feet, with excellence of shape and form and complexion and accomplishments. Well, there you go. It's not just the women, though, who get these wonderful descriptions. Like here's a description from the Second Battle of Moituira, and this is Elaha on his way to make love to Eiru. And she sees him coming toward her. And she saw that it was a man of fairest appearance. He had golden yellow hair down to his shoulders, and a cloak with bands of gold thread around it. His shirt had embroidery of gold thread. On his breast was a brooch of gold with the luster of a precious stone in it. 2 shining white spears, and in them 2 smooth riveted shafts of bronze. 5 circles of gold around his neck, a gold-hilted sword with inlayings of silver and studs of gold. The man said to her, "Shall I have an hour of lovemaking with you?" Oof, it's like something out of a bodice ripper. But this description of the hero Kilhook from the Welsh Kilhook and Olwen might just top it for pure bling. A gold-hilted sword on his thigh had he, and a gold blade upon it, and a gold-chased shield, the color of heaven's lightning, with an ivory boss. And there's more, but I've just cut to the chase. A 4-cornered purple cloak beneath him, with an apple of red gold at each corner. Each apple the value of 100 cows, and the value of 300 cows was there in the value of his boots and his stirrup straps, from the top of his thigh to the tip of his toes. The tips of his hair would not stir, so light the canter of the steed beneath him, as he made for the door of the court of Arthur. I'll be back tomorrow to go on with the story and take you down some more back roads of Celtic myth. So please come along, and don't forget to make a donation on Ko-fi, and check out my other links, which are in the description.